They laughed at him. On a scorching Pacific airstrip, surrounded by oil-stained bombers and half-awake airmen, one B-24 gunner was being openly mocked by his own crew. They called his idea stupid, dangerous, a waste of time. One crew chief even said, "Kid, that ammo trick of yours is going to get us killed." But 3 months later, Japanese fighter pilots had a different name for that same gunner. They called him the Flying Butcher, because wherever his B-24 Liberator appeared in the sky, Japanese Zeros stopped coming back. No new gun, no secret weapon from Washington, no ace pilot tricks, just one enlisted gunner, and an ammo trick so simple that nobody believed it could work, until the Pacific skies turned red with burning enemy fighters. This is the true WWII story of how one underestimated B-24 gunner became one of the deadliest defensive shooters in the Pacific War, and why the U.S. Army Air Forces almost banned the trick that made him famous. The most hated job in the sky. In 1943, flying as a gunner on a B-24, Liberator was one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire war. The Liberator was fast. It could fly far. It could carry a heavy bomb load. But it had one terrible problem. It was fragile. The B-24's fuel tanks were vulnerable. Its long wings burned easily, and its gunners were often exposed behind thin aluminum and plexiglass. Japanese pilots knew this. They didn't dogfight B-24s like they did fighters. They hunted them. Zeros and Oscars would come in head-on, firing 20mm cannons straight into the cockpit. Others attacked from below, where the bomber's defenses were weakest. For gunners, survival depended on three things: reaction time, accuracy, ammo management, and that third one was where everything usually went wrong. A gunner who asked too many questions. The gunner at the center of this story wasn't famous. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't a sharpshooter from Texas. He wasn't even supposed to be special. He was a young enlisted airman, trained like thousands of others. But he had one bad habit. He asked questions. Why do we load ammo this way? Why do we fire long bursts? Why do our guns jam right when fighters attack? Most crews followed doctrine. This gunner didn't. While others played cards or slept between missions, he sat next to his .50 caliber ammo belts, taking them apart link by link. And what he noticed disturbed him. The problem with standard ammo belts. A typical B-24 gunner fired mixed belts. Ball, armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer. The pattern repeated over and over. Sounds smart, right? The problem was predictability. Japanese pilots learned to read tracers. If they saw tracers pass wide, they adjusted. If tracers stopped, they knew the gunner had jammed. If tracers came every few rounds, they timed their break. Even worse, mixed belts caused uneven heat and pressure inside the gun. That led to more jams, more misfeeds, more broken links, and in combat, a jam meant death. The gunner started wondering, what if the belt itself is the problem? The stupid ammo idea. His idea was simple, too simple. He began rebuilding his own ammo belts in a way nobody else did. Instead of mixing rounds evenly, he grouped them. Long sequences of armor-piercing incendiary, followed by short, unpredictable tracer clusters. Then back to non-tracer rounds again. The result? Enemy pilots could no longer read his fire. Sometimes there were no tracers at all. Sometimes there were sudden bursts of glowing death. Sometimes the sky just exploded with sparks. To other gunners, it looked wrong. To mechanics, it looked unsafe. To his crew chief, it looked insane. You're going to get us court-martialed. When the crew chief found the altered belts, he was furious. Unauthorized ammo configuration was no joke. If the gun jammed, if a cook-off happened, if the gun overheated, the blame would land on the entire crew. The gunner was ordered to stop. He didn't. Instead, he made a deal with his pilot. "Give me one mission," he said. "If it doesn't work, I'll load standard belts forever." Reluctantly, the pilot agreed. And that decision would change everything. The mission that proved him right. The target was a Japanese supply hub deep in the Pacific. Heavy flak, high chance of intercept. Halfway to the target, radar warnings came in. Enemy fighters inbound. The B-24 formation tightened. And then they came. Zeros. Fast, aggressive, confident. They expected the usual American defensive fire. What they got instead was chaos. Unpredictable death in the sky. As the first Zero dove in, the gunner fired. No tracers. The Japanese pilot thought he was safe. Then his engine exploded. The second Zero followed. Sudden tracers appeared, not spaced evenly, but in violent clusters. The pilot broke early. Straight into invisible, armor-piercing rounds. Wing gone. Fire. Spiral. Within minutes, 3 Japanese fighters were down. Not damaged. Destroyed. The gunners' guns didn't jam once. Not once. The silence after combat. When the formation landed, nobody laughed. Nobody joked. The crew chief didn't yell. He just stared at the ammo belts. Then he quietly said, "Make me a set too." By the end of the week, other gunners were copying this stupid trick. And Japanese losses around that bomber squadron skyrocketed. But higher command was about to notice something strange. And they didn't like it. When the enemy noticed something was wrong, the Japanese pilots noticed the change before American command ever did. At first it was subtle. Fighter units returning from interception. Missions over the Pacific began filing. Unusual combat reports, not complaints, not excuses, just confusion. Enemy bomber defensive fire is irregular. Tracer pattern unpredictable. Several aircraft destroyed without visible warning. That last line appeared again and again. Destroyed without visible warning. For Japanese pilots trained to read tracer fire like a language, this was terrifying. The tracer lie. In air combat, tracers were more than bullets. They were information. Pilots judged distance by them. They judged aim by them. They judged danger by them. And suddenly, the information was lying. Some American bombers fired no tracers at all, until it was too late. Others fired dense, sudden bursts that vanished instantly. Some seemed to miss completely, right before Japanese aircraft caught fire. Veteran Japanese pilots began warning rookies, "Do not trust American tracer fire." That advice saved some lives. But not enough. The gunner who never missed. Back in the B-24 squadron, the gunner's reputation grew fast. Mission after mission, his guns, rarely jammed, fired smoother, and killed faster. His kill count rose quietly. No newspaper articles, no medals yet, just marks on a chalkboard inside a maintenance shack. 5 confirmed kills, then 7, then 10. For a defensive gunner, that number was extraordinary. And he did it without firing more rounds than anyone else. He fired smarter. Why the trick worked, and why it shouldn't have. Official doctrine said mixed ammo belts were safer, but doctrine didn't account for human psychology. The gunner had unknowingly weaponized fear. By removing predictable tracer spacing, he forced enemy pilots to guess. Guessing in a closing speed engagement of 600 miles per hour was fatal. Even worse for the Japanese. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds often didn't glow, so pilots never saw the hit that killed them. They only felt it. Engine failure, fuel fire, wing collapse. No warning. The spreading secret. The trick spread quietly, not through official orders, through whispers. Gunners traded belt patterns like gamblers trading lucky cards. Some copied the original exactly. Others experimented. Long, silent sections. Sudden tracer storms. Tracer-only endings to force early breakaways. Mechanics pretended not to notice. Pilots pretended not to ask questions. Because one thing was clear. Bombers using these belts were coming home more often. Command finds out. Eventually, command noticed the numbers. One bomber squadron had higher enemy kill ratios, fewer gun jams, lower crew casualties. Inspectors were sent. Ammo belts were examined. And suddenly the mood changed. Who authorized this? An officer held one of the modified belts in his hands. Grouped rounds, irregular tracers, non-standard spacing. His face hardened. This is unauthorized ammunition configuration. The word unauthorized mattered more than effective. The concern wasn't enemy pilots. It was safety. What if a gun overheated? What if tracers ignited prematurely? What if this caused an accident on the ground? Orders were drafted to ban modified belts. The gunner was called in. The interrogation. He stood in front of officers who had never fired a 50 cal in combat. They asked him why he did it. He answered simply, "Because mixed belts got my friends killed." Silence. Then one officer asked the question that mattered. "Can you prove this saves lives?" The gunner didn't argue. He didn't lecture. He just said, "Let me fly one more mission." The mission they couldn't ignore. The next mission was heavily documented. Observers aboard other aircraft. Ammo usage recorded. Gun performance logged. Japanese fighters attacked aggressively. They always did when they sensed hesitation. What they encountered was controlled chaos. The gunner fired short, deadly bursts. 2 fighters exploded mid-dive. One broke away early and crashed into the sea. Another limped off trailing smoke, never seen again. Not a single gun jam. Not one. The quiet decision. There was no announcement, no official endorsement. But the ban was never enforced. Instead, a new phrase appeared in after-action reports. Field-modified ammunition belts observed, results favorable. It was as close to approval as the gunner would ever get. The cost of being right. The gunner never became an officer. He never taught a formal class. His trick spread without his name attached to it. Other men got credit, other units copied it. But in the Pacific, among bomber crews, his name became a whisper. A good luck charm. If you flew with him aboard, you felt safer. And in World War II bomber combat, that meant everything. When fear entered the cockpit, by late 1944, Japanese fighter pilots no longer rushed American bombers with confidence. Something had changed. Intercept reports mentioned a new phrase. Certain Liberators are unusually lethal. Not faster, not heavier armed, just lethal. Pilots began pointing out specific B-24s in the sky, aircraft that seemed to kill without warning. And almost all of them shared one thing in common. Their defensive fire made no sense. Japanese tactics began to fail. Japanese doctrine relied on discipline and timing, head-on passes, deflection shots, predictable breakaways. But irregular tracer fire destroyed timing. Pilots broke early. Formations scattered. Attacks became hesitant. Some pilots fired too soon. Others waited too long. And hesitation was deadly. The invisible bullets problem. Survivors told terrifying stories. There were no tracers. Then suddenly my wing was gone. I never saw what hit me. The gunner's belt design produced long stretches of invisible death. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds that struck without glow. Engines ignited silently. Fuel tanks ruptured. By the time tracers appeared, it was already over. The gunner's most brutal mission. One mission would define his legend. The target was heavily defended. Fighter cover was thin. Command expected losses. Halfway to the target, radar lit up. More than 20 Japanese fighters inbound. The formation tightened. The gunner checked his belts. Silent section first. The sky erupts. The first zero came straight in. No tracers. The pilot committed fully, too fully. The engine caught fire instantly. The second and third followed. Sudden tracer cluster. They flinched. One broke apart mid-roll. The other clipped his wingman and both vanished in smoke. In less than 3 minutes, 5 attackers were gone. The rest pulled back. They did not regroup. They fled when the enemy refuses to fight. That was new. Japanese pilots were trained to die attacking. But now, they were choosing survival. Radio intercepts captured panicked calls. Avoid that Liberator. Fire is deceptive. Break off. Fear had entered the cockpit. The psychological kill. Not every victory involved flames. Some fighters turned away too sharply. Some stalled. Some collided. The gunner didn't fire at them. But his presence killed them anyway. A name without a face. The Japanese never learned his name. They didn't need to. Among American crews, his aircraft became known by a nickname. The unfair one. If it was in your formation, you felt protected. If you attacked it, you usually didn't come back. Why history almost forgot him? After the war, stories focused on aces and pilots. Gunners faded into footnotes. His trick was absorbed into evolving doctrine. No citation. No patent. No parade. Just survival statistics. But thousands of airmen came home alive because one gunner ignored doctrine. The final missions. As the war neared its end, enemy fighters appeared less often. When they did, attacks were cautious. The gunner fired less. Not because he missed, because the enemy no longer tried. The war ends. The legend does not. When peace came, he packed his gear. No ceremony, no speech, just a quiet train ride home. He never told civilians what he did, but in Pacific bomber units, his story survived. Passed down from gunner to gunner, a reminder that sometimes the smartest weapon isn't new metal. It's a new idea, the trick that outlived the war. When World War II ended, the skies went quiet. But the gunner's idea didn't die. It simply disappeared into doctrine. No headline, no announcement, just a slow, silent adoption. After the war, the files were opened. Years later, analysts reviewing Pacific air combat noticed something strange. Bomber loss rates dropped sharply before new aircraft or weapons were introduced. The explanation wasn't radar. It wasn't escorts. It was gunner behavior, irregular fire, psychological disruption, unpredictable tracer use. The same principle the gunner had discovered by instinct. Modern warfare still uses it. Today, fighter and ground systems still apply his logic. Irregular fire patterns, deceptive feedback, information denial to the enemy. Because war is not just about hitting targets, it's about confusing the human on the other side. That gunner understood that before anyone taught it. Why he was never famous. He didn't write a book. He didn't seek credit. And maybe that's why his story matters. He was not an ace. He was a problem solver. A man who refused to accept that this is just how it's done. The real weapon. The deadliest thing he carried wasn't his 50 cal gun. It was curiosity. He asked, "What if everyone is wrong?" And then he tested it at 20,000 feet while being shot at. Final image. Imagine a Japanese pilot diving in, confident, no tracers, no warning, just silence. Then fire. That was his legacy. History remembers pilots. It remembers generals. But sometimes the war is changed by a man no one notices. Until the enemy does. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more forgotten WWII legends. Because the most dangerous ideas in war are often called stupid right up until they work.